and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. In 2018, the OECD Programme for International Student Assessment at PISA conducted its first evaluation of students' capacity to live in an interconnected world. The assessment focused on students' knowledge of issues of local and global significance, including public health, economic and environmental issues, as well as their intercultural knowledge, skills and attitudes. The results of this assessment, PISA 2018 Volume 6, will be launched this Thursday on the 22nd of October. This webinar is a chance to hear about the main themes addressed in the volume, as well as find out more about what to expect from the data. Today, I am joined by Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills. We also have two OECD senior analysts on hand to answer your questions, Miyako Akita and Mario Piacentini. Before handing over to Andreas, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping points. Firstly, I'd like to welcome those who are watching on our Facebook page and remind you that you are more than welcome to ask questions by commenting on the video throughout the webinar. For those of you connected by Zoom, you can ask your questions in the chat on Zoom. We will soon give you the link to the PowerPoint that is presented today, and the recording of this webinar will be available at our webpage www.oecd.edu today.com/OECD-education-webinars. That's everything for now. So Andreas, I pass the floor over to you.
Thanks so much. Also, I really want to acknowledge my colleagues, Miyako Ikeda and Mario Piacentini. They are actually the designers of this amazing instrument that we're going to present to you today. You know PISA for its assessments of reading skills, mathematics skills, and science skills. We have done that for over 20 years, but in light of an increasingly complex, volatile, ambiguous, and interconnected world, countries also felt it was very, very important to look at the capacity of students to see the world through different lenses, perspectives, appreciate different ways of thinking, different ways of walking. And that is what we call global competencies. So that was a clear ambition among the countries that are taking part in PISA to go beyond assessing just, the kind of traditional school subjects and look at the way and the extent to which young people are being prepared for the interconnected world in which we live today. So that is basically the idea behind this assessment, and it's very innovative in its design. You're going to see that. The only caveat I have to make today is that we're not going to show you results. If you expect that, join us again on Thursday. I'm going to come back to this at the end, where we actually launch the report and present the results. So what I'm going to do today is just introduce you to the idea and the instruments and what you can expect on Thursday in terms of the results. But once again, if you look through the questions that we have tried to ask ourselves, are young people able to critically examine the issues they see around themselves? Issues that have a global dimension, an intercultural dimension. Do students understand but also appreciate different ways of thinking, different perspectives? Sometimes, when you can do that, you also understand the limitations of your own perspectives. And it's not just about the passive kind of understanding. We also wanted to see to what extent students are actually able to act respectfully across personal, cultural differences. Do students care about the world? What actions are they willing to take? What trade-offs are they willing to make when it comes to, dealing between yourself and others? What inequalities do exist in access to opportunities? We put quite a lot of emphasis in this assessment on studying the opportunities that students have to learn and the context in which they grow up. That's why we collected not just data from students, but also from school leaders, from teachers, and in fact, in a number of countries also from parents. You're going to see on Thursday how closely the views and experiences of parents in this field actually relate to what we see from students. So the context is really very important. So those are the questions that this assessment seeks to answer, and I think does answer in a very compelling way. So really, it's a fascinating data set. Now, the question often comes is, what's the role of schools in all of this? Isn't this something of families, of out of school experiences? And yes, of course, there is a lot that this has to do with things that other than schooling. But let's not forget that schools are often the first place where actually children encounter the diversity of society. You could say, well, today there's lots of technology around, social media and everything, but social media still tends to connect you with people who think like you, who walk like you, who look like you. And that's different in school, at least in school systems that are not too highly segregated, where actually there's a quite interesting mix coming up and students are confronted with other views, with other ideas, with other ways of thinking. So school is an important place to study this. Schools also can play a tremendous role in providing students with opportunities. We looked at the intended curriculum. To what extent are those kinds of issues embedded in the learning materials that schools are providing? We looked at the implemented curriculum. To what extent do teachers actually draw on those materials? How are they going to use them? How well are teachers themselves prepared to deal with global and intercultural issues? Schools can also equip students with an appreciation of other cultures. Once again, schools bring together many different perspectives, and also they can incentivize and encourage and enable experiences that facilitate international and intercultural relations. In fact, today in the digital age, there are entirely new possibilities for this. Now, we look, for example, in this assessment, both at experiences students have directly, getting in contact with other schools through traveling. We looked at this through digital means, so to what extent are schools actually connecting. We looked at the community context, but there's a lot of ways in which schools can facilitate contacts with diversities. And of course, schools have a big role to play when it comes to the value of diversity. We look, for example, at the relationship between student attitudes to others and the way in which they perceive discrimination from their teachers. And you can see in many contexts, those tend to be quite highly correlated. So yes, global competency is developed in many contexts, but we believe, and I think the data supports us in this, that schools really have a major role to play, or can play a major role in this process. Now, the big question, of course, is how do you conceptualize this idea of global competencies? And there's been years and years of discussion in the PISA governing board and with expert groups. It's been a long process. You can imagine PISA brings together now over 80 countries, and to reach a consensus on how to define global competency has taken time, has taken energy, has meant a lot of intercultural debate in itself. But I think the result is very compelling. It starts out with the idea of the students' capacity. Can they examine local, global, and intercultural issues? Can they analyze this? If you drink a cup of coffee in London or Paris, do you understand that could have implications for the work environment of people in Brazil, in Colombia? So I think that these kinds of issues can be actually looked. We looked at the material aspects of culture, how the kind of way in which people behave, dress, and the social ones, and also subjective aspects of culture. So can students effectively combine knowledge and also critical reasoning to establish an opinion on an issue that extends across borders, across cultural borders? We looked at the extent to which they can draw on and combine on the disciplinary knowledge and modes of thinking that they acquire in schools, and sort of can extrapolate from knowledge they have on those kind of new contexts. Clearly, this requires higher order thinking skills. You need to select and weigh appropriate sources of evidence. It requires some degree also media literacy, not being able to navigate complex information, often in a digital world. So that's what it means to do well on this aspect of examining local, global, and intercultural issues. But it's not enough. We also felt, or countries felt, it was very important to see to what extent students are willing to understand and appreciate the perspective and worldviews of others. And that involves not just the capability to understand global issues, but also the willingness to engage with other perspectives and behaviors and multiple points of view. It means recognizing that the perspectives and behaviors, including your own, are inherently influences and concepts of reality. So it's hard to find sort of objectivity is just one dimension of this. So globally competent students in PISA are ones that can retain their identity, but are simultaneously aware of the cultural values and beliefs and people around them. They can examine the origins and also the implications of others and their own assumptions. That's basically the second dimension of the PISA assessment. The third one is the extent to which students engage in open, appropriate, and effective interactions. Now you can see before we we move from the perception to basically taking action, and that requires that you can adapt your behavior, talk with people who behave differently, think differently, adapt your communication style. So you can see here basically things get much harder. And students are expected to interact with others in ways that are open, showing sensitivity to other people, other cultures, appropriate, basically respect has a big emphasis throughout the assessment. And of course, you need to reach others effectively, even if they are different from you. So globally competent students, according to PISA, create opportunities to take informed, reflective action and also find ways to have their voice heard. And the last step is the one that was sort of most difficult to capture. That's actually the readiness of students to respond to a given local, global, or intercultural issues. Not being able to mobilize your cognitive, social, and emotional resources to actually take action. That's the fourth dimensions. So that's basically the concepts that underpin this assessment. And now, how did we assess it? First, we used the cognitive test. That's what PISA is quite familiar with. Now, looking at the knowledge dimension and also the cognitive skills dimension. Now, for those, we could actually deliver an actual test. But then when it comes to social skills, social emotional skills, student attitudes, for that, we developed questionnaires that are based on self-reports. So you're going to see a lot of scales with questions posed to students that try to reflect those different constructs. The values dimension is one that we have not been able yet to quantify. So you're not going to find this embedded in the instruments, but they remain a very important dimension of the framework of global competence, because ultimately, this is about having a kind of compass and the navigation tools to find your way through a world that is increasingly volatile and ambiguous. So that in a nutshell is the design of the PISA instruments. So you're going to find an assessment, a test looking at the knowledge and skills, and then a survey of the social skills and attitudes. And as I already mentioned, we also surveyed teachers, we surveyed school leaders, and we surveyed parents. Not in all countries, but wherever countries were agreeable to doing this, because we wanted to study the interactions between the different stakeholders. Now, to what extent do the views of parents shape the views of students? To what extent does behavior of teachers shape the openness of students to the world? And so on. And again, the findings of this are absolutely fascinating. And they also show that actually education can do a lot to foster students that are more open to the world and more willing also to take responsibility for other people. Now, here you see a map of the countries that took part. You can see that's 56 in total. 27 countries did the full assessment, including the cognitive test, and 39 did only the survey of students, the questionnaire component. And you also see that there are many PISA countries that choose not to engage in this assessment, and so there is overall a smaller number of countries. But I do believe with 56 countries, we have a very good evidence base. And once again, this is the very first time a comparative assessment of this nature has been undertaken. And I am confident that it's going to stimulate a lot of discussions and will lead to a further development of the instrument and then extend their global reach. Now, if you think about it, PISA started with less than 30 countries, and then it grew. More and more countries taking part in this. So quite confident that you're going to see a similar evolution on an important dimension like this. And I do believe that this current pandemic context has made that dimension of global competency even more relevant. I think we are all understanding now that our individual behavior is shaping, the context in which other people live, and that there are important interactions that actually we're not living alone in this world. What happens in one part of the world can immediately disrupt and affect people in other places, and how communities respond to those challenges is having a huge influence on how we can live and thrive in this world. So I think that's a starting point, but again, 56 countries is a very solid base to do that. Now, let me just sort of highlight the most challenging part. You can test people, but then how you make sense out of their responses. And global competency is something that you can't assess simply with a multiple choice question. You need to design quite complex tasks, often involving scenarios for students. And then when you have the data, you need to think about how do you actually score that. And that's been actually a process where we put a lot of effort into. And I'm sure, my colleague Mario Piacentini, who has led this work, can tell you this perhaps the hardest part of the process to reach agreement among countries on how actually to score students' responses. And basically what we did is we try to map each cognitive, each response into sort of a category of basic, intermediate, and advanced. And I'm going to show you just a couple of examples. I highlighted before, some of the tasks required students to inform themselves, form a viewpoint among multiple sources, navigate complex information, contradictory information, weighing the reliability and relevance of those sources. And to do that at the very basic level, we expected that students could take the information at face value without considering the contextual factors. You do read something, you take it as a given. That's basically the most basic level. Then at a more intermediate level, the student considers contextual factors to assess the reliability of a source. Does this make sense in the broader context of other information? They can detect clear biases. They can detect inconsistencies, but still they have a still rather limited view of reliability. They can sort of see to what extent that information fits into the bigger picture, but not have a more systematic assessment of how valid this is. And then at the advanced level, students understand perspectives as intrinsic to sources. Essentially, anybody who writes something has a certain perspectives. They can distinguish the communicative intentions of sources and claims. They can take into account stated and unstated premises in a statement about global or intercultural issues. Those were basically the students reaching very advanced levels. So you can see those were the rubrics that were given to those people who then rated their responses in order to arrive at the student scores that you're going to see on testing. Now, this is one example. Let me show you another one. More challenging. We wanted to see to what extent people are able to recognize the perspectives and worldviews of others. You can imagine here scoring gets a lot more difficult. At a very basic level, the student has a quite simplistic view of perspectives, one person, one view. At the more intermediate level, the student sees differences in perspectives as rooted in cultural, in religious, in socioeconomic, in regional, in other backgrounds. They recognize that they also hold their own particularly worldview, coming out of those different dimensions. That's an intermediate level. And then at the advanced level, the students can describe and interpret multiple perspectives and also articulate how those are related. And the students also understand that an individual's identity is complex, One can hold multiple identities simultaneously in different contexts for different stakeholder groups. And eventually also students recognize that they too hold a particular world view. So that was basically the advanced level on recognizing perspectives and worldviews. Let me give you yet another example, understanding the norms of respectful dialogue. Now that was the third dimension of this assessment. So at the basic level, a student lacks awareness of the social impact and effects on others of different communication styles. You just talk the way you talk and you don't really understand how that may influence people from other contexts, from other backgrounds, from other cultures. At an intermediate level, the student understands some of the social impact of different communication styles, including how linguistic choices may result in a breakdown of communication, or you use the wrong word, and suddenly, you create barriers. And then at a very advanced level, the students can anticipate and manage breakdowns in communication. That's not just, understanding it, but actually being able to respond to this and change and adapt your communication style to those differences. Students can employ linguistic devices such as avoiding categorical claims, providing restatements, connecting to what others have actually said, sharing questions and puzzles, and acknowledging the contributions of others. So that's basically an example of the rubrics. There are a lot more tasks in this. And then when it comes to the questionnaires, here are some examples. Now, for example, we wanted to know to what extent students are aware of global issues. I have never heard about this. I've heard about this, but I wouldn't be able to explain what it's really about. I know something about this and could explain the general issue, and I'm familiar with this, and I would be able to explain this really well. We asked them about climate change. We asked them about pandemics. And you're going to see how varied that is across the world. In some countries, actually, students learn about pandemics and they feel confident. I can talk about this, I can explain it. In other countries, a large majority of students has very little kind of insight. So these things vary. We look at migration, we look at impacts of developments in the global economy, but it's all just about awareness here. We look at international conflicts and malnutrition, on causes of poverty, and on equality between men and women in different parts of the world. So that was about the awareness. And then there were other constructs, adaptability, cognitive adaptability. I can deal with unusual situations. I think this is the key word of the times in which we live, is about resilience. And to what extent can I change and adapt my behavior? So that construct of adaptability is quite important. And each of these constructs was composed of, a dozen of questions that we then scale to arrive at a kind of scale score for each student and ultimately for each country. Respect for other people from cultures. An example question here would be, I value the opinions of people from different cultures. We looked at global mindedness. An example question here is, when I see the poor conditions that some people live under, I feel a responsibility to do something about it. That's the kind of agency part. Self-efficacy regarding global issues. I can explain why some countries suffer more from global climate change than others. Self-efficacy means I can sort of overcome some difficulties. I can sort of deal with certain situations. We looked at students' engagement, another construct, engagement with others regarding global issues. An example question here would be, I keep myself informed about world events, via social media, and then global competence activities at school. I'm often invited by my teachers to give my personal opinion about the international news. And then, we have the answers to those questions. We break them down by gender, by social background, and sort of by demographics. We relate them to attitudes of teachers, attitudes of parents. We relate them to the behavior of teachers, and we look at the context in which students learn, the whole overall learning organization and environment at school. And that's really what you're going to see when the results are launched on Thursday. I had one more slide, but I can't find it here, so I'll stop here. That was actually with the information of the launch, and I'll make sure that we're going to have that ready before we get to the end of this. But with this, I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Thank you very much, Andres. That was very informative and there was a lot of information, and we've actually got quite a few questions coming in. Just a reminder, again, if you are on Zoom, if you want to send a question through to Andreas and our analysts, please do so in the chat, and on Facebook, if you just put it in the comments there, that will be sent through to us. So to start us off, Andreas, we have a few questions just about global competence kind of as a concept now in the COVID world. So in terms of the COVID pandemic, it seems like it will change the ways in which we are connected with other people. Will these findings from PISA 2018, are they still relevant in this COVID era?
Well, I would actually say, more relevant than ever. The capacity of people to understand the global connectedness of issues. And this is not just about pandemics, but to truly understand what I'm doing here and now has implications for other people somewhere else. I think that kind of idea of global connectedness is more relevant than ever. But I also think the dimensions of empathy that we look here, empathy at the individual level, empathy at the institutional level, empathy at the systemic level, I think they are as relevant as they could have ever been. The concept of cognitive adaptability. In fact, we didn't anticipate how much adaptability students needed to bring with them. Suddenly, 1.5 billion learners were kicked out of the schools. They had to get on with, technology and building other bridges to their teachers. And it's put a huge strain on people's capacity to change. So I think having information and data on this, to what extent that is something students are comfortable with, is very important. I also believe the kind of questions that we pose to teachers, to what extent are teachers willing and open to students from different contexts, different backgrounds, with different views, engage with diversity. As a teacher, what I think the one lesson teachers have learned from the pandemic, you cannot just broadcast knowledge. You need to engage with how different students learn differently, and maybe differently at different stages of their development. And so I think that this assessment is just, coming at the very right time.
Great. And then I suppose a follow-up question from that is the idea of the global competence module. Is that something that PISA is planning to do again? Are we going to have longitudinal results and sort of connected to that in terms of getting more countries involved? Do you think that that is something that will happen in the future?
Yeah, how to take this further is a question that the PISA governing board, the member countries that are taking part in PISA, will need to evaluate. Usually those surveys come back in cycles. Now, we wouldn't do that in every assessment, but like, for example, we assessed problem-solving skills first in 2003, then we picked that up in 2012 with a further development. In 2015, it became collaborative problem-solving. So I wouldn't think that you'd see the same global competency assessment just to have trend measures. I would think that there will be an evolution of this. What we understood, that we have not captured many dimensions that are really very important on global competency. This is really a starting point. You're going to see further development work in this, and at some point, hopefully, it's going to come back in the cycle. What we are also thinking of is actually to embed it in our school-based version of PISA. What we had already heard from many schools around the world, while one thing is how my country does, but I really want to know how my school is actually responding to those issues, because they are not part of the formal curriculum. I have no other ways to assess learning outcomes. So there's a great interest among many schools to see how they come out on this. And therefore, we may embed the global competency assessment in our school-based version in its current form. So that would be basically just the existing instrument.
We've had a few questions come in, and yes, for those still writing questions, please do, they're very interesting. So one about global competency and the idea of it being different or the same for students that are existing in different kind of political or just different countries and cultures. Does PISA think that a globally competent student is the same? It's a one size fits all? How does the assessment actually deal with the political and potentially different cultures?
Yeah, as an international project, that is a question we have really struggled with, bringing together so many countries from so many kind of, not just political, but also social and cultural contexts. And I do believe that we've found actually quite compelling answers to this. First of all, we try to avoid the notion of political context. You know, some people have defined, have talked about civic education, and we try to avoid concepts that relate to political systems. What we are really interested in here is how do we deal, it's the human dimension of global competency, not the political one. We're not interested in students' views on political systems and designs and so on. We're really interested to what extent are students willing and open to engage with other ways of thinking, with other people, with other cultures, in whatever political system they grew up. And the questions that underlie the assessment and the survey have been designed collaboratively by the participating countries. They're validated by the countries. So countries feel all very comfortable with this. I also want to sort of say this is not, you know, about one size fits all. Actually, one of the most interesting aspects of this assessment is its multiple dimensions. And that makes the report that you're going to see on Thursday very complex. Global competency is not, you know, linear scale where you can say you have more or less, but it has so many different facets and features. Now, the attitudes, the skills, the knowledge, and then, you know, respect and empathy and agency. They are all concepts that we had to try to measure separately. And the multidimensionality helps us to understand different contexts. You know, some countries, some students may be very strong on specific parts, specific components. Other countries may be strong on other parts. So we're not putting everybody on the kind of, that's the difference between an assessment of mathematics and science.
Definitely. A slightly more, I suppose, technical question. A lot of people are asking about getting access to the questionnaire. So I might pull in OECD Senior Analyst Miyako Akita. If you could just let us know where people could access the question, if they want to find out more about these questions, how could they get that information?
Thank you, Alison. So can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
So this is the PISA website, oecd.org/PISA. And if you click, first I will start with the questionnaire. If you can now click data, and then you can see all the data from the previous assessment until 2018. And if you click 2018, you can see the questionnaires answered by student and also school and teachers. So if you click the student questionnaire, you will find global competence questions included in that. And then the school questionnaire are responded by principals, and the teacher questionnaire are responded by teachers, and then also the parent questionnaire. And then on Thursday, we will upload all the micro level database on this page, so that all global competence related data will be available. And so going back to the first question about the test items. So today we launch the global competence released item on this page. So if you click PISA test on the PISA website, and if you go down, you can see 5 units from the global competence test released today. And this is the interactive version of the test which exactly the student took. So for example, the first one, if you click the raising sea levels, you can see the item, and then there's the text that you have to read, and then on the left there are questions. And then if you click yes, no, or no, yes, and then if you click, you will get the pop-up which shows what are the correct answers at the bottom, and then what kind of the cognitive process is this item measuring, and what is the difficult items. This is a quite difficult item because level 4, and so on. So you can now play with this, and there are 5 release items. As Andres said, global competence item will be embedded in the PISA, school-based PISA program. Therefore, we don't release everything. We just release 5 units in order to keep the test units for other projects. And also the very good feature here is if you click view all language versions, you can see not only the French and English source version of the test items, but you can see all the national version of the test items here. Thanks.
Great.
Thanks, Miyako.
Thank you, Miyako. Andreas, did you want to add anything to that, or you? No, great.
I think, but again, I think we, are not only showing these items, we encourage people who want to use them and the survey questions and in contexts that are relevant.
Great. And question from someone on Facebook, again related to COVID, which I know is on a lot of people's minds. So COVID has taken learning online, in addition to all the interactions children already have online. How does this test measure the skills that students learn and use, particularly online and, for instance, on social media? Does this test talk about those particular global competence skills?
Yeah, that's actually something that already the PISA test does quite well. The reading is tested in a digital context. So students to do PISA typically have to navigate information sources, work online and so on. So I do think that's something that is not specific to the assessment of global competency, but the PISA test in general is designed to assess literacy in a digital world. Now that's basically something that we have taken on seriously for some years already now.
Great. A few questions just coming in about why some countries didn't take part in this particular assessment. So are the results of countries who only did the questionnaire and not the cognitive test as valid as those who did the full assessment? And what were the reasons why countries didn't participate? I think you went through that, but maybe if you could clarify.
Yeah, first of all, the cognitive test and the survey are quite different components. We report them separately. So countries that did the survey but not the cognitive test are reported in those parts of the volume where we don't need the kind of cognitive test data. So yeah, we report all of the data that were collected. Countries have quite different reasons why they don't choose to participate in this. And some, it's, this is not, something that is emphasized in the curriculum, sort of it's something that's a bit outside the regular, it may be operational constraints, it required additional kind of students being assessed. So countries have there are different reasons. It's of course unfortunate that the number of countries is still more limited, that countries tend to prioritize reading, math and science over what I would argue is at least an important dimension in the world in which we live today. But those are choices that countries make for their own, and the answers may vary a lot by context.
Okay, so a few more questions coming in. One in particular is saying, how do you expect the results that are released on this Thursday to impact schools and curriculum moving forward? How does global competence assessment actually impact?
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to share with you the last slide where you're going to see the information coming out. We are doing this to launch jointly with the American Field Services, a global conference in 2020 on the 22nd of October. It's going to be an online event. So that's just as a piece of context. You can look at the hashtag already now. And so let me get out of this. That's basically what we are going to show on Thursday. But the question, the second part of the question.
So the question is, how do we expect the results to impact?
To shape.
So is it going to change curriculum? Is there going to be a subject created? Is that what we're expecting? What do we think?
Well, I think the first thing that we will see probably is that countries will see that embedding this in the intended curriculum has quite an influence on students' capacities and outcomes. That's actually something that surprised us, how close that link between the intended curriculum is. So if countries value this, there is a way to bring it into schools. I think the issues around curriculum design will be debated, will be discussed. We see how closely teacher behavior is shaping the results. Now, I think that was, again, one of the most fascinating parts. The attitudes of teachers to diversity shape the way in which students think about diversity, and schools see that. So I think these are all questions that I hope, systems, when it comes to system design, will take away from this, teachers, when it comes to teacher behavior, the role of parents. So I think this assessment has huge potential to at least help us think more clearly about how we can address issues around global competency through different levers of policy.
Great. There's a particular question here, and I'm not sure who's best to respond to it. So what about out of school youth who are not located in the school setting? Have we taken them into account, and does global competence apply to them? So we talked about the school setting in particular, but for those out of school youth.
It's a good question. It's a fair question. That's a real limitation of PISA as it stands today, that it does not include students who are not enrolled in school. Basically, it's a school-based instrument, a school-based test. And there is nothing that suggests that global competency is less relevant for young people not in school. So I think that's something that PISA should be doing, but it's just operationally very, very difficult. We have actually made a start with this last year. With a few countries developing an out-of-school test for PISA so that we actually collect information on 15-year-olds who are not in school. And the results are going to be published also before the end of this year. But that's just sort of more of an experiment to fill that gap. But I think it's a very legitimate question and a limitation of PISA as it is today. It's just looking at those who are enrolled in school.
Great. Another question talking about, would it be possible to assess the capacity of a given education system to promote change in behaviour and not only just knowledge and skills? So talking about, they've given an example here, so behaviour towards the environment. So over time, a change in behaviour, is it possible to assess that in this kind of test?
Well, you know, there are many questions in this global competence assessment that look at that. They look at whether students are willing to make trade-offs between, you know, the individual benefits and the benefits of the broader community and environment. They are looking at the actions that young people are willing to take to protect the environment, to work with others, to protect, you know, their classmates from injustices. So I think we look very much at the behavior and action-oriented part. We also survey teachers on those parts, not, you know, what's in the school book, but how you are embedding those ideas into the way in which you teach. Now, we're not asking this to the social science teacher, we're asking that to every teacher in the school. So yeah, a lot of this assessment is really related to behavior, because ultimately global competency is at least as much about behavior and taking action than it is about knowledge and skills.
Interesting. Okay, so there's still just a couple more questions coming through. So people are very interested in this topic, which we really appreciate. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone at the launch on Thursday. One question here, are teachers teaching to the test? So the global competence test, is there a specific curriculum used for global competency, or are schools at liberty to design their own? What do we know about global competence in the different countries that we are looking at?
Well, you know, PISA is a low-stakes test. It just applied to a sample of schools. It has no consequences for individual students or teachers or schools. So I don't think there's any reason why anyone would teach to this test. You know, there's nothing you gain from doing better at an individual level. So teaching to the test is not so much an issue. But the question, of course, you know, how do you teach global competency is a very relevant one. And I don't think it's so much it's an issue of a, you know, additional school subject and how you embed this idea of global competency into how you teach every school subject. In fact, you find interesting aspects from many different school subjects in our assessment. Global competency really brings together the scientific, the social, the cultural aspects. And it is, you know, a great example that could be facilitated through project-based learning, where teachers from different subjects actually work together. And there are some countries, some schools very advanced with this, some school systems highly advanced in this, and you're going to see that in the results. Now, for some students, these are all familiar questions. They do really well because that is something that is valued in their school system. And for others, this is a novel phenomenon. And again, this enables countries to learn from each other, from, you know, the curriculum design, the curriculum implementation, the teacher preparation. We can see to what extent teachers are confident in teaching global competency or intercultural issues. We can also see to what extent they express a need for more professional development, which means, you know, I need to really learn more about this. All of that is available from this assessment.
Great. And I suppose a more technical question, so I might invite Mario Piancinettini, the senior analyst, just to respond to the idea of what the school and teacher questionnaires are trying to capture. What was the aim of those school and teacher questionnaires? So Mario, if you're available.
Thanks, Alison. Yes. The purpose of the teacher and school questionnaire is really to understand and to make sense of the responses that students give to both the cognitive test and to the questionnaire, and to understand how they are related to specific practices in the schools, but also not just about like whether like teachers make connections to global topics in their courses, but also more generally about the school, make connection to the school environment, to the way teachers teach, and to what extent, for example, they use pedagogical approaches like project-based learning that really engage the student as knowledge creator, as agents of their own understanding. So essentially, we use the information from the teacher and the school questionnaire to understand and to explain differences in results that we get from both the test and the questionnaire.
Thank you, Mario. Another question for you, Andreas. You mentioned that the results will show that parents can play a role in changing attitudes and actions. How could schools or education systems get more parents on board to promote global competence in terms of policy change?
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And in a way, education is always a whole of society project. That's probably one of the takeaways from the pandemic. Many parents have understood and taken to heart how much their own role matters in this and what the work of teachers actually is like. So I think the pandemic has brought people closer together, and I hope that this will transpire, you know, in the post-pandemic period into closer collaboration on giving parents a better understanding of the curriculum. Now, what are the ideas behind the curriculum? Why is this important? Making parents aware that their own attitudes have a really big influence on the behavior of their students, on the views of their students towards the world. I think even that awareness is going to make a difference. And I think schools building better connections with parents, I think that can make a huge difference. You know, that this is one of the takeaways for me from this is really that if you try to solve all of those problems through the school curriculum, you're not going to be very successful. If you actually enlist all of the stakeholders to your cause on this, you can make a huge difference.
Okay, so I think probably the last question before we sum up is, do factors that are beyond students' control, so things like gender, socioeconomic status, affect their global competence? As much as you can share. I know we can't share particular results today, but if so, how can those gaps be overcome?
Yeah, actually, you do see very significant gender gaps. You do see very significant socioeconomic gaps. But what's so interesting from a comparative study is that those gaps vary across countries. You know, if they would be the same, I would agree with the premise, you know, there's not much that school can do about it. But the fact that we see those gender gaps play out so differently across countries, the fact that we see even socioeconomic gaps play out so differently across countries, that actually should encourage us that there's a lot that public policy can do, that education systems can do, that teachers can do, that students can do themselves. So I would be more optimistic that actually, even though, you know, socioeconomic contexts can have a huge influence on how students learn, teachers teach, and schools operate, that we can mediate that impact through public policy. And that's really what the international comparisons are about.
Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for the questions that you have put in. It's really great to see your interest in this topic. Thank you particularly to Andreas, Miyako, and Mario for joining us. And what I suppose we need to sum up is how to get these results. So they're being released on October 22nd. So in PISA 2018 Volume 6, you will find a link to the publication at http://www.oecd.org/PISA. The information will be there at 11 a.m. on the 22nd. We do invite you to tune in to the virtual launch event, which will be live streamed at the AFS Global Conference at 3 p.m. Paris time on Thursday. Andreas will be giving a presentation and going into the results at that time. You can find out more about the conference, including keynote speakers, at conference.afs.org. We really do encourage you to look into that. To keep up to date with all of our work and our data on education, please follow us on Twitter at OECD EduSkills or on Facebook. We thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday and at some of our events soon. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, Alison, for hosting us.
No worries.